All right. So our next guest came all the way from Los Angeles to be here today, and her podcast is the Cramped Podcast. She's going to be talking on getting discovered, and her name is Kate Downey. So everybody give a hand for Kate Downey.
Oh my God, it's such a big stage. It takes so long to get over here. Hi, everybody. My name's Kate Downey. I come from Los Angeles to be with you today in Fayetteville. I am so happy to be here, and this is the fanciest library I've ever been to in my life. So thank you for having me. Getting discovered is such a funny concept. When I hear the words get discovered, I think of Courtney Cox getting pulled up on the stage at a Bruce Springsteen concert before getting cast in Friends. And I think often we think of discovery as one time, one momentous moment where you are pulled out of obscurity and then the rest of your career is set, your destiny is set. It feels like luck. It feels like being in the right place at the right time and having someone with power choose you. But most of the time that you or your podcast get discovered, it's not that dramatic. It's one listener at a time. It's 500 passive listeners, and then one listener who posts about your podcast to their audience. It's 3 listeners who then go and tell their friends, and that turns into 9 listeners, and that turns into 100. And an often overlooked kind of discovery is the kind of discovery that we do ourselves. Not us getting discovered, but us discovering something that leads to the next thing. We're constantly discovering things within our podcast. A tighter focus on the topic, a guest who changes the way you think about your subject, a story that you have to tell your audience. We're discovering new editing workflows that make our life easier, make it more possible for us to create more content. We're discovering new creative approaches to the constant churn of content and podcasting. I want to talk about all 3 of those kinds of discovery, starting with the last one, the kind of discovery that we do ourselves. I originally wanted to be a Broadway actress. That didn't work out. That 10-year plan did not happen. It's a tough career path when you grow up on a mountain in rural Maine. So I was just your average theater kid. I went to Northeastern University in Boston for theater, and I discovered 2 things: Shakespeare and sneaking into the theater late at night to put on secret variety shows with my friends. Still basically a theater nerd, but getting more specific about the kind of theater I liked making and learning that looking up obscure Elizabethan phrases in old lexicons was actually really fun because it unlocked meaning in something that felt boring and inaccessible before I had that information. I still wanted to work in theater, but I had discovered that I was more interested in researching, interpreting, and producing than I was in singing and dancing, which I was never really that good at anyway. That led me to New York, where I worked at New York City Opera, behind the scenes, assistant directing, and then to the Public Theater, where I had an internship in the artistic producer's office. I thought this would be the pinnacle of my life. I thought, hey, I'm here at the Public Theater, New York City, where they make Shakespeare. What more could a gal want? But I discovered I didn't like producing big, expensive, shiny theater. I missed the scrappiness of those shows that I produced in college. I didn't like looking at spreadsheets all day and not being in the room when creative, interesting things were happening. So I responded to a job posting looking for people who are good at talking and researching and interested in art, but you don't have to be an expert. That's what the job posting said. I showed up to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I ended up getting a job as a tour guide with a third-party tour company there called Museum Hack. This was a crazy time where I was researching deeply these art objects and the history of the museum, and then creating 2-hour tours and leading small groups of 12 people through the museum, showing them objects that they normally would walk right by, telling them stories that they didn't think could possibly exist in such a stuffy, shiny institution. It changed the way they thought about the museum. It changed the kinds of experiences that were possible for them in that museum just because of the research I did and the stories I would tell them. I discovered that I loved this. I loved the power to change people's minds about the world they lived in. And doing that through entertainment, having them have a wonderful time and laugh and talk to each other while also changing the way that they looked at this thing forever. It was giving them information they could use. This discovery changed my life. I followed this discovery and started getting more interested in science and history. I met a theoretical physicist turned storyteller at a science talk in a bar in Brooklyn, and together we opened a venue in New York City for science entertainment called Caveat. We hosted 20 shows a week, from comedy about dark matter to live podcast shows about food history to theater pieces about Hypatia and the Library of Alexandria. I loved doing this, but it was frustrating that so much work went into every single show we put on, but only 140 people could see each show. We tried turning some of our shows into podcasts, which was my first foray into actual podcasting. Although I had been a podcast listener forever, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the podcast Professor Blastoff, but I spent my early years in New York breaking down giggling on the subway, listening to Tig Notaro and her co-host just have an absolute blast. So we tried turning some of our shows into podcasts so that more people could hear the amazing stories that were being told on our stage. You haven't heard any of these podcasts because they didn't go anywhere. No one listened to them. We didn't know what we were doing and they weren't that good. We didn't know how to record correctly the stories that were happening on our stage. The sound quality was crap, even though the content was great. And so I discovered I needed to get better at that, at recording and getting that sound on tape. That wasn't something I had ever done in my life as a theater artist. When the pandemic hit, I was unemployed for 18 months, and I discovered that I hated that. I'm a workaholic. I need to always be working on something. So I produced a podcast called Space Bus for kids who were doing remote school so that their parents could have 5 minutes in the morning where their kid was listening to a podcast. They could peacefully drink their coffee before becoming their teacher as well as their parent. No one listened. It went nowhere. But I learned a little more about what it means to have a value proposition for your audience and how to clearly communicate that. It took a solid year of applying for hundreds of jobs, but I finally got a job in podcasting. And I'll tell you what that is. There we are. I was making audio biographies for a company called Himalaya that no longer exists, but I learned how to edit. I used what I had learned putting on live podcast shows at Caveat, and I produced live shows for Revisionist History with Malcolm Gladwell and Wondery's show Scamfluencers. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about getting discovered in terms of someone else discovering you and giving you an opportunity. Working on that Wondery show got me discovered in the sense that a Wondery executive liked my work, liked how I worked with the podcast hosts, and offered me an opportunity to develop a show internally at Wondery. This turned into the podcast Dis and Tell, which is still running today. I've been doing that for about 2 years. It is deep dive breakdowns into celebrity feuds. So a little bit of a departure from my science background, but I have so much fun every day treating each of these celebrity feuds as if they are as big a deal as dark matter or the history of food. And it pays the bills. At a party in LA, I was talking to a friend who was managing a podcaster who was trying to take her show independent. She was with Stitcher, and if you've been following the drama of Stitcher, it was the right choice to go independent. Her manager was just chatting with me at a party, and while we were talking, she said she was trying to take this show independent, had no idea what to do, and I sketched out on a napkin an idea I had. I thought, she's got a really engaged audience on social. It's not huge, but with that engaged an audience, I bet Patreon could work for you. and I sketched out a mix of Patreon, live shows, and independently produced episodes that I thought could work as an independent structure. She took that napkin to her client, and her client hired me as a producer and a member of their company. I did that for 2 years, and that show is Glamorous Trash with Chelsea Devantez and is still running today. I was out in New York with a friend from Caveat, drinking heavily at a very loud bar, and I mentioned that I have had excruciating period cramps since I was 14. I've never had a diagnosis, and I've never really found anything that helps. And I wanted to make a podcast about finding answers to this pain and why it was so hard to find answers in the first place. My friend, it turns out, had just started working for the Simons Foundation, and she told me that they have a grant program for pieces of art or culture or entertainment that mix something creative with science. And she said this would probably be a good pitch for one of their grants. It took me a couple years to actually apply for the grant. I had a lot of development to do and a lot of questions to answer, a lot of discovery to do about this topic for myself. But when I was finally ready, I pitched, and they accepted my pitch and gave me the opportunity to make the first season of a podcast called Cramped, which you can find on any of your podcast apps right now. The feed just went live last week, and I will ask you to subscribe because we are starting to release episodes in February, and I would love to be in your feeds at that point. In looking for a nonprofit to partner with to receive the grant, I connected with Ty and the Arkansas Podcast Collaborative, who gave me the opportunity to come and be here today. Cramped would not be happening without this discovery, so it's one of the most important times I've been discovered, is by the Arkansas Podcast Collaborative. So being discovered doesn't happen once. It happens 100 times a day, every time you meet someone new, work on a new project, or simply show up. And then, of course, there's being discovered by audiences. And I won't stand here and pretend to be an expert in marketing. I'm not. I am a content gal. But as a scrappy, independent producer, when I'm not at my day job at Wondery, I've learned a lot about what helps you find your audience. There's a lot of podcast industry talk about how the podcast world has a discovery problem. YouTube and Spotify and socials all have algorithms that push content to people. Algorithms you can game, you can learn the rules, you can play by the rules, and you can temporarily get your content more visible. Podcast discovery has always been more mysterious. And this drives big companies crazy. I'll tell you from the inside of Wondery, they get so tied up in knots about the fact that they don't have a formula or a template that they can follow every time to get success, to get listeners. I love this fact about podcasting. It is my favorite thing about podcasting. The number one way audiences find the podcasts that they listen to is through word of mouth. Isn't that incredible in this day and age? Like, podcasts, a thing you listen to on your phone, are still living in the realm of a person has to tell another person about it for it to be successful. I don't think enough of us take advantage of this. Every year there is a new podcast, an indie podcast, one or two people with a microphone in their basement who just have a good idea, an idea that resonates. We are still in a place with podcasting that is possible, that the good ideas can rise to the top. They don't always. It's not a foolproof system, but there's a shot. We have a shot, even if we have no money. So, if the number one way that new podcasts are discovered by listeners is through word of mouth, how can we make sure it's our podcast in people's mouths? So I think no matter what three kinds of discovery that we're talking about, there are a few points that help. One is authenticity, which I'm rolling my eyes as I say that because that word gets used to death in podcasting. Everyone wants to say you have to be authentic, but it is true. And authentic is one of those words that can mean whatever you want it to mean, but ultimately, authenticity is something that should feel a little scary. And I say this as someone who has spent the last 6 months making a podcast about my period cramps, so trust me on this. It means going somewhere other people aren't going. It means being vulnerable. And that, if you're producing a show for a company, that's gonna look different than if you're producing a show about a deeply personal topic. But as long as it is authentic to your company and authentic to the people making the podcast, that will still come through. And authenticity can mean so many different things, but a huge, huge part of it is going somewhere scary. So if you are making a podcast and you are very comfortable making that podcast, great. You're probably not getting a bunch of new listeners. You need to go somewhere uncomfortable. That's when people really listen. I think another thing that really helps discovery is when you work with other people. As you may have noticed, I am what they call a yapper. I am very extroverted and I like to talk. So it's pretty second nature for me to seek out other people who are doing the same thing and see what I can do to help them and see maybe if there's something they're willing to do to help me. And this doesn't have to involve money. Sure, you can dump money into paid promo if you've got it. Why not? It doesn't hurt, but it doesn't always do the trick. What is much, much more successful is finding other shows with audiences that you think would overlap with you and your show and working together. Have them on your podcast. You go on their podcast as a guest. If they don't do guests, do feed drops. Just reach out on socials and say, love your show. I'm doing something in a similar vein. Do you ever do promo swaps? Would you consider doing a feed drop? My show, Cramped, is about period cramps and trying to find answers to them. There's not a lot of other shows doing that. But there are lots of shows about medical mysteries. There's a lot of shows about women's health. There's a show called Bodies by Allison Behringer that is basic. I actually pitched her to have my whole show run as a Bodies miniseries. That's how closely our shows and our audiences, I think, are aligned. We got on a Zoom call, we chatted about it. Doing the whole show as a Bodies miniseries wasn't gonna work out for various reasons, but she's now going to drop 3 of my episodes in her feed because it just so happens when my episodes are coming out, her show will be on hiatus, and she agrees that her audience would really love this podcast. And so for the good of her audience, for the good of my audience, they're just gonna do that as a favor. I'm not paying for that. Because podcasts do so well with word of mouth, podcasters are really generous. Doing something nice for you means you're gonna do something nice for them. There's no downside. It's a really amazing sort of barter economy in podcasting. And it never, ever hurts to just reach out to the people who are living in the same world as you. Despite the fact that we are all living through our screens, on our mics, in our little sound booths or bedrooms, it is always so nice to get a message saying, I see you, I discovered you, I want to help other people discover you. No one is upset to get that message. So those are just a few things I think can help with discovery. One last one actually is a very clear value proposition. This can take years to find. It's why it took 2 years for me to pitch Cramped to the Simons Foundation. You have to find a reason people should listen to you. Is the reason that someone should listen to your podcast that you have a story no one else is telling? Do you have information that people want, that people need? At first, I thought my story was just going to be about me finding an answer to my problem, which was period pain. And that still is part of it, but the bigger value proposition this show has for my audience is that every single person dealing with severe period pain is mostly doing it alone. We do not have a culture. I'm up here talking to you about my period cramps. Not many people do that, okay? And I think that needs to change, but it means that everyone dealing with this feels alone. Most people dealing with this feel like they're the only ones experiencing this pain, which means that what my podcast can do, more than give specific information or tell a story, is make people realize they are not alone. And that's a big, lofty goal to come from something like period cramps, but that's what makes it authentic. That's what my story is. I was alone in my pain until I started talking about it, realized how many other people were out there that I never knew about, also experiencing this pain, and how insane it was that we didn't have answers. I think that is a story people want to hear. People don't want to feel alone in this anymore, and people can use the information that I have found through my research and talking to experts. Now look, I'm telling you all of this. This show hasn't come out yet. It could be another show no one listens to. I don't know. But I hope, these are the hopes that I have for the show and the ways that I'm working towards getting discovered. And I hope that's helpful. That's it. I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah.
How do you manage multiple podcasts?
Oh, I mean, I think the answer is you just do. I definitely started doing it slowly. For about a year and a half, I did the Wondery podcast and the Glamorous Trash podcast at the same time. Because, you know, who doesn't need multiple streams of income? Since my days of theater, when I decided I don't like spreadsheets, I have fully embraced spreadsheets. I use an app called Todoist to keep track of what needs to get done for each project and when I'm going to do it. Airtable is a great tool that I use with my team at Wondery to make sure every single task gets done on our remote teams. Slack. I mean, those are very granular pieces. Ultimately, for me, the most important thing is to see clearly what needs to get done and what needs to happen at each step of the way. Be really clear about when it needs to happen, who's doing it. Communicate clearly with everyone you're working with that this is what has to happen and here's who's gonna do it. And I try to run a team. I have a saying, there is no such thing as a podcast emergency. I worked in live shows for so many years, and there are so many live show emergencies, as I'm sure Ty and the RCAST team can tell you. Anytime you have an event, there are emergencies. There are things that have to happen right then. You have to drop something and go on to the next thing. It can't be late. You can't not do it because people are physically there in the room. There are no podcast emergencies because, listen, the worst thing that happens is your audience doesn't get a free piece of media until the next day. So, like, it's fine. And so in that way, I try to run the teams that I run with a lot of understanding, a lot of covering for each other. As long as there is communication, as long as people are telling me when there's a problem and we are working together to fix it, it's fine. It's gonna be fine. If you want me to go, I'm happy to chat. Anyone who wants to chat about like productivity and planning, I will nerd out hard, but I want to be able to show you my screen in order to do that. Let me get one more.
Since you're talking about getting discovered, can you tell us the story about the first time you were like out in public and someone was like, oh my gosh, I listened to your podcast?
No, that's never happened to me. Because my voice Cramped will be the first time my voice will actually be on a podcast. All of these other shows, well, that's not true. I've been on some episodes of shows, but Cramped will be the first time I will actually be hosting a show. Thank you. Yeah.
Have you ever used Patreon or other just sources to get extra content out there? And how have you seen extra content come back and affect your podcast or your show or whatever you're doing to get more followers? Like, just that kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, so Glamorous Trash is on Patreon and depends like very heavily on it. It really helped that Chelsea, the host of that show, had a not huge but substantial and very active following on Instagram. And she was one of those people that like lives on social media where it was not stressful for her. This is not me, I can't do this, but for her, she was a TV writer, so she would be in this like chaotic environment all day and then get home and want to be on social media, posting, messaging, answering messages from people she'd never actually met, having conversations. Like, that stresses me out. I'm a talker, but I'm an in-person talker. I'm not an online talker. So her following translated really nicely to Patreon. I have seen a really close correlation between how active someone is on a platform like Instagram or Twitter or TikTok, in responding and speaking directly with their people, with their followers, and how that translates to Patreon. That parasocial relationship thing is very real, and I think in Chelsea's case, it's not parasocial, it's just social. Like, she is genuinely, personally talking to each and every single one of these people. And again, I don't know how she does it. That's not for everyone. But through the Patreon, we kept our team very, very small. So it was just me, the host, and her manager for a while. And the Patreon was able to pay for me to work on the show, was able to pay for us to put up cash for us to do live shows, which really helped. It really helped casual fans become committed fans by showing up to these live shows and having personal interactions. I love live shows. I love the kinds of relationships you get with your audience from live shows. I love how silly you can be at a live show, how much fun they can be, what community building events they are. But they also do the very practical thing of getting someone hooked in a little deeper to your world. Personally, we did a very standard setup of like we would do for a while we did two public episodes a week and public episodes a month and one Patreon episode a month. And we would release the teaser of the Patreon episode on the regular feed to try to get more people to sign up. Does that answer your question? Okay.
So we are a very interview style podcast.
Yeah.
We had a couple of our listeners who've reached out and said, we want to hear a little bit more from you. We want to hear, like one of our listeners kind of gave us the feedback of, hey, we'd love to hear like extra content over here about like your like just your opinion of the guest that you just had on, or not your opinion, but just like a follow-up or an overview or debrief of that. And they said, you know, you might do that as like extra content, and we're kind of like extra content.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was just wondering if it's worth it. You know, if it's worth it to put in as much effort into that extra content as you're putting into your actual podcast show.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, there's no one answer to that, right? Like, it completely depends on your relationship with your listeners and your relationship to your content. You know, I would say from a producer standpoint, that would be pretty easy to work into the workflow, because after you get off Zoom or whatever with the guest, you could just pop on your camera, your microphone, whatever you're going to use, and talk into the mic for a little while. If you have a great back and forth with your listeners or your patrons, you could get more information from them. You could, you know, what kinds of things would you want to hear after an interview? Do you want to hear, do you want to hear catty shit, or do you want to hear like, further musings on the subject, or like how this has affected your worldview? How highbrow or lowbrow do you want to get? Those kinds of things I think are really important to understand about your audience, and are easy to get the information from, because if you have a Patreon, those people are very easy to communicate with. They're paying for you to communicate with them. So putting up a poll, asking them for feedback, they love it. It's why they're there. And I think that goes in with value proposition, right? You've got the value proposition of the whole podcast, what listeners are showing up for. You've got a subset of that who are paying to listen to more or to have a closer relationship with you. What is the layer of added value proposition that they want, that they would appreciate? And that's really a collaborative thing. Like, you don't get to say that top down. That has to be something you figure out together. Try some shit. Sorry, I'm in my swearing mode. Try things, see how they resonate, and some things are gonna work better than others, and it'll surprise you. Like, you may think they want one thing, and it turns out you do like a deep dive into like a strange side topic, and that's the thing that they like clamor over. At Chelsea's, at Glamorous Trash, one of the ways that we did added value for the patrons was, the show was basically set up like a book club. Every episode was about a book, which meant Chelsea had to read a book for every single episode, which she decided to do. I didn't tell her to. And so we decided that a certain level of patrons would get to be invited to a Zoom call with Chelsea, and it would be a real book club. Everyone would read one of the books from the podcast, so she didn't have to read an extra book that month, and we would get on and talk about it. And there were only maybe, I don't know, like 150 patrons at that level, and only like 30 of them would show up to this book club every month, although all of them were invited. But the same people showed up month after month, and they would be the people we would go to. Like, I became friends with some of them because we were just sitting on a Zoom call once a month for a couple years. I would just message them on Instagram and be like, we're thinking about doing this. Like, what do you think about that? Would you like that? And they'd be like, yeah, I would yes, absolutely. Or they'd be like, what if you did this instead? And they loved that because that meant that they were helping to make a thing that they loved. And at that level, people just want to be more of a part of this. Again, you're never gonna bother somebody by saying, your opinion is important to me. I really want to make more stuff you'll like. People will be happy about that. Yeah?
So keeping your podcast indie versus working with someone like Wondery, what are the kind of pros and cons of that? And then the second part to that question is, what do you need to have in line for approaching someone like that to pitch a show idea?
Yeah, okay, wow. I could do a whole talk just on those two questions. Okay, indie versus established. So I actually taught a class in pitching your podcast, which is very funny because I've only sold one podcast, and it hasn't been sold. I got a grant. But I think the answer to that question lies in what you need to get out of it. Because podcasts are gonna take all of you. Podcasts are gonna take all of your time, all of your energy, everything you can pour into it. It's you. You are this podcast. And you need to know what you need to get back from it to make it worth it. And that answer is different for everybody. Like, for some people, it may be a paycheck. For some people, it may be a better reputation or a higher status in their, they want to be thought leaders. That's the word. So they don't care about making money from it. They just want to get their ideas out there and to have people think of them when they think of this topic. For some people, they just want to have fun with their friends once a month and make a thing together. They don't really care if a million people listen to it. For some people, it's about getting clients for a business. It's a top of funnel thing. Each of these goals or these priorities have a very different path. If what you care about is a paycheck or getting a higher status, like putting your name out there more, it may make sense to pitch to a company like Wondery or any of them, really. I have a soft spot in my heart for smaller companies like Multitude, who I'm working with on Cramped, just because they tend to treat you more like a real person and to be more committed and invested in what you're doing. But absolutely, like places like Lemonada, Wondery, Spotify's not making their own stuff anymore, but those places can really get your name out there. That being said, to get a place like Wondery to say yes to you, you need a lot of stuff in your corner already. You need to either have a big following already, because nobody's taking chances. That's not true. Big companies are not taking chances right now. Big companies don't know what's going on, and they are worried. And most of these big companies, by the way, are bloated with big money, and they don't know how to monetize these podcasts well enough to get a significant return on that. So that's the reason you are seeing basically only new podcasts come out of these companies with famous people, because that is what big companies and big money, that's what they go to when they don't know what is gonna work. They want somebody who has name recognition, who's going to pull at least, 200,000 people so they can make their budget back on ads. This isn't gonna last forever. There's gonna be another boom of indie podcasting. It's all cyclical. But right now, I think if you don't have a huge following behind you right now, you're better off seeking independent funding or building an audience organically so that you can be self-supported. Did that answer each of your questions? Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm curious if you have any, by the way, great talk.
Oh, thank you. You too.
I'm curious, it sounds like you would have some kind of like out-of-the-box suggestions for people to grow their shows. Like the period one, like I can imagine like you can get so creative with the ways to market your show. Do you have anything that you've heard that you're like, oh my gosh, that is really interesting? That you're like, because I always like challenging the, what's being done. So
Yeah.
do you have any favorite ones that are like completely unexpected? From local podcasts?
I mean, I've seen a lot, so I think whether it's unexpected or not depends on where you're coming from. Like, for a lot of people, doing a live event for a podcast seems crazy and out of the box. For me, that's like step one. And so, but I think for me, that is authentic to how the show is hosted. That is authentic to what I love doing, the kinds of rooms I like being in. And so I think, you don't need something totally unheard of to make a splash or have it be successful. I think that sometimes that stuff can venture into like stunt territory where it's like, is anyone actually enjoying this? Or is it just like a kind of crazy thing that maybe goes viral, but then do you actually get listeners from that? Because that authenticity thing really like has to be present in the ways that you're getting new listeners. Because if you do like an ad on a roller coaster and people go to your podcast and you advertised on a roller coaster, so they're expecting something with that energy, and it's like a very quiet, like contemplative, slow-moving thing, like that's not gonna work. So I think there are lots of ways to match energy. I think there are lots of ways to seek out people who are going to be aligned with your podcast in unexpected ways. So, I'm sure there's a lot of book podcasts that could be advertised at the library. I'm sure, I will be putting my little flyers with my podcast information at like women's health clinics, at, community centers, like, because there's actually, that's a value add. Someone who might be at a women's health clinic might be interested in the information and be looking for exactly that. That's not out of the box, but I think, it doesn't need to be sometimes. You can confuse people by going too out of the box, I think. But I do think like within live events, there's a lot of different things that could be. So to me, there's nothing better than getting a bunch of people in a room together and forming community and, delighting them with something and then having unstructured chat time. But that would look different for every single podcast. I wouldn't do the same kind of event for every single podcast. Yeah. Anybody else? Cool. Thank you, guys.